I'm Farris Beasley. I'm co-chairman of the Camp Blount Historical Site Association. And this afternoon I'd like to share with you a little bit about Camp Blount. Not too many people in Fayetteville and Lincoln County realize the significance of our little town in the War of 1812. We were involved in providing a lot of soldiers for two of the most important battles in the War of 1812. The Creek Indian War, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then the Battle of New Orleans. And the way we were involved is that we were the closest state to something that happened that was very significant in the War of 1812. Here's an artist presentation, historical artist David Wright, of what happened at Camp Blount, just below, about a mile south of town on the bank of the Elk River. This picture happened October the 11th, 1813. Now, what was happening in October the 11th, 1813? We were in the middle of the War of 1812, and Fayetteville was involved. The four principal characters here that the painter David Wright painted. This is Major General Andrew Jackson on the horse. That's Ensign Sam Houston. He's a member of the 39th U.S. Infantry. The third person over there is Sergeant David Crockett. And the fourth person is Dr. Charles McKinney, who General Jackson employed to take care of his troops while they were here at Camp Blount. So why these four men, of course, are the principal characters in the picture, but these are not the most important people. These folks back here, the Tennessee militia and Tennessee volunteers, you see them here and here, 3,500 of them showed up. So why are these people here and where are they going? The War of 1812, as we said, was going on. War of 1812 was kind of an extension of the Revolutionary War. The British and the Americans had declared war again after the Revolutionary War was over, because the British, we were a very weak country. We were broke, didn't have any money, and we badly needed to trade with Europe, sell our agricultural products to them for money to make our country grow. And they saw that we were weak and still had hope that we would fail and come back to them for help. So they started stopping our ships on the high seas, checking for their sailors who had left the British Navy at the end of the Revolutionary War. And so they were trying to capture them and bring them back into the fold. So this was an excuse to upset our shipping. And it was pretty devastating. They blockaded the port at Boston, shelled it, bombed it, shut down the shipping out of it. Then they went down to Baltimore Harbor, bombed it, shelled it, landed at Baltimore Harbor, walked overland, and set fire to our new Capitol and to our new White House. They had the strongest army in the world, of course, at that time, but as strong as that army was, it wasn't big enough to occupy our country. All the patriots had guns. And so they knew they couldn't occupy the country, so they, after burning the Capitol and the White House, they got back in their ships. Instead of going back home, they went to Jamaica. Now, why did they go to Jamaica? They went to Jamaica to train for the invasion of New Orleans. They knew they couldn't take our country, but they knew they could probably, without any problem at all, take one city, New Orleans, with the force of men that they had. They had 14,000 soldiers. When the battle occurred, General Jackson had 4,000 men there. So it was pretty much a given that they were going to win that war and occupy New Orleans and control the Mississippi River, which was the main part of the commerce of our country at that time. The British trained there from, they left the U.S. in about August of 1814, went to Jamaica until December of 1815. They left Jamaica about the middle of December, in 1814, and proceeded to head towards New Orleans. Jackson left this area about the first part of December. He had 8 companies of soldiers. He had 2 companies from Kentucky, 2 companies from Tennessee, a company of free blacks from the New Orleans area, a company of pirates under the head of Jean Lafitte, and a company of another company of soldiers from the area. He had 4,000 men, as I said, in all, and the British had 14,000. They left Jamaica in 50 barges under the command of General Pakenham. Now, General Pakenham was a professional soldier in charge of the greatest army in the world at that time, and he was taking on General Jackson and his 4,000 recruits who had never been in combat, had never fought together before. As far as we know, General Jackson had never had 1 hour of professional military training. And he was facing a professional military commander, General Pakenham. The battle was such a given that it was going to be a victory for Great Britain that General Pakenham had his wife on board his command ship so that when the battle was over, he would be commissioned Crown Prince of the new royal colony of New Orleans, and she would be the Crown Princess. So they were set up for a pretty big deal. The battle occurred on January the 8th, 1815. The British came into the battle site, and the battle site was selected by General Jackson. Even though he wasn't a professional soldier, he had a knack for setting up a battle that completely disarmed the advantages of the superior forces. So he didn't want to fight in the streets of New Orleans, so he went 3 miles below town, set up his artillery on both sides of the river so that the British ships would have to stop and get out and walk to the battlefield. They had to walk through a swamp. General Jackson had taken over a large plantation 3 miles below New Orleans, and he had this plantation had an old abandoned canal running across it. The canal went across that plantation. Of course, in those days, those plantations were thousands of acres of land. This canal went across that plantation and about 3 or 4 other plantations, and the purpose of the canal was to bring cotton bales out of the fields to the Mississippi River and put them on the boats. The canal was about 1,000 yards long. It ended up in a swamp on the far end. So when the British came in, they marched in shoulder to shoulder, as the typical fighting was in those days, the Napoleonic method of fighting. They walked across the field towards General Jackson's line. Now, that canal had been abandoned for a long time, so it filled in with dirt. Jackson spent several weeks with his soldiers cleaning the canal out to where it was about 6 feet deep. He filled it with thorn bushes, and the dirt bank behind it, after he cleaned it out, was about 8 feet tall, 1,000 yards long. Jackson had 12 cannons spaced periodically on top of the rampart of dirt. And as the British walked in, they didn't see any soldiers. All of Jackson's 4,000 men were crouched down behind the line, and even the cannon people were down behind the line until they got within cannon range, and the cannon crews jumped up. The guns were loaded, they fired. Of course, when they fired, They killed a lot of British troops. As the British troops fell, they were trained to fill in the gaps and keep on walking forward. As they got within rifle range, the order was given, and the first 1,000 men all stood up at the same time and fired at the same time. And again, hordes of British went down. Again, they were trained to fill in the gaps. They filled in the gaps and kept walking forward. As they got closer, the second command was given. The second group of 1,000 stood up and fired their rifles. The other soldiers were loading the guns for the ones that were firing. There were a lot of British soldiers down by this time. As the battle got more advanced and more soldiers were lost, General Pakenham, who was on a white horse at the back of the troops, saw that it was his time to encourage his soldiers who were beginning to slow up and back up. So he whips his sword out, drives his horse forward, shouting for the men to keep advancing. He was shot, hit in the knee. His horse was killed, so he went down, grabbed another horse, got back up, rode forward again, and this time he was shot in the head, and that was the end of the battle for General Pakenham. His second in command did what he was supposed to do, whipped his sword out, rode forward on his horse, extolling the soldiers to keep advancing. He was killed. And by that time, the younger British officers apparently said, you know, things are not working out too good. Maybe we need to go to Plan B, which was to evacuate the site and go back to their ships and head home. So the British lost 1,200 casualties in that battle. The General Jackson lost 11 soldiers, which was pretty remarkable. So this was the final battle in the War of 1812, and the British went home, and the end of the war was ended. Before that event, in October of 1813, when this picture was depicts what happened that day, they assembled here to go to the end of the Creek Indian War, which was the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. The British had armed several of the Indian tribes on the frontier with military rifles to create more problem for the pioneers. And so the Creek Indians were in kind of a civil war with each other. The warring faction of the Creeks were wanting to send word to President Madison that they were not in any way going to give up their land. They were not going to sign any treaties. They weren't going to any kind of a reservation. They were in conflict with the other half of the Creek Indian Nation at that time, which had kind of resigned themselves to signing the treaties, giving up their land, and going to the reservation. The warring faction wanted to send a strong message to President Madison that they were not going to give up their land. So they attacked a small military reservation at Fort Mims in August of 1813. The settlers around that area knew that the Indians were on the warpath, so they had gone into the little military encampment for protection. And at dawn in late August 1813, 1,000 Creek Indians attacked the little military camp there. They killed everybody there, 250 men, women, children. The description of the deaths of the children were pretty tough to read. When word of this massacre reached President Madison in Washington, of course he was shocked, the nation was shocked. He sent word to the governor of Tennessee, Governor Willie Blount, to answer that massacre. Governor Blount, in turn, sent word to Lieutenant General Andrew Jackson, in charge of the Tennessee militia, to call forth the militia, call for volunteers, and meet at Camp Blount. And as we said before, they met at Camp Blount. It was a nearest jump-off point from the frontier state of Tennessee, and the reason they went from Tennessee was because there was no Alabama at that time, there was no Mississippi at that time, there was no Louisiana, so Tennessee was the closest state to the massacre. And they left here in October 1813, finally surrounded the creeks on the Tallapoosa River near the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and defeated them. They killed 900 Creek Indian braves and lost 45 soldiers. President Madison was so impressed with the victory that General Jackson brought about that he appointed Jackson Lieutenant General in the regular U.S. Army and gave him the responsibility to protect New Orleans. And then, of course, we know about the Battle of New Orleans. So our little town served as a muster site, a meeting place to train the armies. It was not a battlefield. There's no battle that occurred here. But we set up the soldiers and trained them to go to the two battles that were 9 months apart. So that's the significance of what happened here at Camp Blount. And it's something we need to honor. It was a most important thing that happened, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that we were involved in that. The state of Tennessee purchased the remaining land that was Camp Blount about 3 years ago. It's 39 acres. They gave about $10,000 an acre for it, purchased from a private individual. And since that time, we've been developing that land, Camp Blount, named after Governor Blount, of course, and getting grant money and different money from the state. Governor Haslam, in his final year, gave us $500,000, which sounds like a whole lot of money, but it doesn't go very far when you've got engineering studies to do, and we've done 3 different archaeological digs on the place. But we have a paved parking lot now for cars and school buses. We have a 7.5-foot bronze statue, which was built by Wayne Hyde from Pennsylvania. And that statue is in honor of the 1st Tennessee Volunteer. And it's the only statue in the state of Tennessee that's dedicated to an unknown Tennessee volunteer. The statue is, as I said, 7.5 feet tall on a 6-foot stone base. It's got unbelievable detail. The sculptor just did a wonderful job on it, and we're hoping that'll be a great draw for tourism to come and honor that. Towns that have a significant tourist site have a lot of tourists to visit their town, so we're hoping that's what's going to happen. That's kind of the story of Camp Blount. If you have any questions or comments.
We're open for anything, but I will say, can you tell the story about how Tennessee was a volunteer state, how it became the volunteer?
That's where, right here is where that started.
Right, yeah, Camp Blount is where Tennessee became the volunteer state. It's one of the major places where it became the volunteer state. And it became the volunteer state during the War of 1812. They called, after the massacre at Fort Mims, Governor Blount called for volunteers. They called for 2,000, and 3,500 showed up. The next week, a Nashville paper, for the first time in history, wrote an article about what happened in Fayetteville at that time and used the term Tennessee, the volunteer state, for the first time in history. General Jackson kept a diary during the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, Indian War, and also the Battle of New Orleans. And many times in the diary, he used the term, "My Tennessee Volunteers." So that's where the name came from. and we need to honor that. That's significant.
Thank you very much.
You did an awesome job.